Recently I went back and replayed the God of War trilogy again, and yeah, the series is still based, but I gotta admit, if you were to hold a gun to my head and say, hey, what are some flaws in God of War? Well, I'd tell you to get bent for a start, but in all seriousness, we'd be starting with the first game, and there are a few things I'm not too fond of. On the gameplay front, in crowded battlefields, my attacks sometimes have the habit of auto-targeting non-threats instead of the enemy that I'm trying to point to, and also it's a bit of a pain that you can't slide down climbable walls like in later games. I also don't like the Cerberus enemies because they have a habit of infinitely respawning. The hardest part of the entire game is a random battle on a cliffside because of these guys. And on the story front, I'd say there are two things that I take relative issue with. First of all is, spoilers, the strange contradiction with the end of the game. Kratos takes Ares' throne and becomes the new God of War. They say he watches over war for the rest of time and even flashes forward to a bunch of battles throughout history, and then by the end credits, Santa Monica have announced their intention to make a sequel. Was that a last-minute addition because they thought this game could be enough of a success to garner a sequel? Well, I don't blame them. But it's still strange to establish that this is going to be his role for the rest of time and then all but confirm that his story is not over. And my second issue with the story comes with the scene that is the linchpin of the entire series. The scene where Kratos is tricked by Ares to kill his wife and daughter. The plot point itself isn't bad. In fact, given Kratos' characterization, it's the best way to have Kratos turn on Ares because his family is the thing that he holds most dear. Whatever Kratos understands as love is what he feels for his wife and daughter. His wife is, after all, the only person that can brave his fury. It's just the presentation of this scene that kinda leaves me scratching my head a bit. I should mention, I say scene, but of course it's split into two scenes about an hour apart in gameplay, but I consider them to be one scene because, in essence, they are the same scene, just with the conclusion being shown an hour after the fact. Either way, I have my issues. The most immediate reason for this is that within the context of the game, there's nothing that really leads us to believe that Ares was the one at fault here. Kratos was plundering and conquering for the glory of Ares, but Ares wasn't the one swinging the blades of chaos. The thing is, there's really not a lot of information about this particular event that the game really gives you. The two scenes depicting this are very to the point, and so as far as the presentation is concerned, this is just a standard day on the job for Kratos as a disciple of the God of War. So based on how the scene goes, whether intentional or not, he was the one that seemed at fault. I guess as the player character, we're predisposed to be on Kratos' side because aside from having that inherent connection between player and player character, we've also seen all the suffering it took to get to this point. It's a moot point either way because Ares takes responsibility, therefore it's his fault regardless of how the preceding flashbacks were presented. Or that's what I thought, because even as big of a fan of God of War as I am, I wasn't giving this game enough credit, I don't think, because there is somewhat of a push and pull in this regard. There's no clear indication that Ares was the one giving him the orders to tear the village or the temple to the ground. At best, it was implied because Kratos was a disciple of Ares. But there is a key line in this scene that I never really paid any mind that actually is of much more significant importance than I gave it credit for.
My wife, my child, how? They were left in Sparta.
My wife, my child, how? They were left in Sparta. I never really even thought about that line, but it justifies this entire plot point in and of itself when you think about it. Because just based on what we see in the game, we have no way to know just how far this place away is from Sparta. It's just nondescript town in ancient Greek lands number 472. All we know about it is that Kratos is tearing it down because they worship Athena, and of course, Athena and Ares have a rivalry. But for Kratos to exclaim that his wife and child were left in Sparta, it implies, if not outright states, that they weren't supposed to be there or couldn't have been there, and there was no way for them to have been there by accident. That combined with the bit where Ares pops his head in and tells Kratos that he's proud of him paints a conclusion from a combination of context. Say that 5 times drunk. A conclusion that states Ares was responsible for all of this. To my knowledge, it's never said that Ares transported them there, neither in the game nor the 2010 novelization, which I totally legally own, but this is enough for the player to presume that to be the case. To be clear, I haven't read the whole 2010 novelization. I've read chunks for the sake of context, specifically the chunks that are relevant to my research, but who has time to read a whole ass book these days? I literally haven't read a full book since I finished the Heroes of Olympus series in 2015. Yeah, I suppose I do have a type. The fact that it never specifies from what I've read is a bit of a shame, considering that the book adds a lot of important context elsewhere. The unspoken narration in regards to Kratos' actions adds a lot of depth to his character, like the final scene as he's ascending to the throne of the God of War. It shows that he sees visions of future wars, but also shows based on the narration that despite this being the future he sees, he has every intention to be a malevolent God of War. Those final lines are not only haunting, but really gives you an insight into the mind of Kratos leading into God of War 2. They want a God of War? He will show them war the likes of which they've never conjured in their worst nightmares. They screwed him for 10 years straight, and now he's a worse monster than even Ares before him. That is great. And that's only one example. The book is evidently filled with these extra details that aren't in the game because the game is a more silent and introspective look at a pained stoic character. So the game lets his actions speak for themselves. It also changes key scenes, like how there's this one scene with Aphrodite that wasn't in the game, and it even adds additional scenes, like the several cutaways to Olympus where Athena and Zeus are discussing the current events. It really characterizes Zeus as a heartless, cold douche while making you feel sorry for Athena, because Zeus is the one who's adamantly refusing to take away Kratos' nightmares, while Athena is the one pushing for that as best she can. She's trying to play peacekeeper and make everyone happy, and it really makes you feel for her because Zeus is the one who's not having any of it. So everything that happens to Zeus is ultimately his own fault. It's a bit of a retcon, but it's definitely one that I'm willing to accept because, quite frankly, within the larger context of the rest of the series, it makes all the sense in the world. Even before Pandora's box was opened, Zeus was a massive douche. And that also applies to Greek mythology as a whole. So with that all accounted for, it's a shame that the book doesn't add any more specific context to this event from what I can tell, even though it would be as simple as adding a few lines. Of course, the narrator helps sell this point with what she says as well.
A cruel trick, orchestrated by the God of War.
But to me, the entire point of a narrator is to explain further context and bring across the unsaid, but whether or not the point of the scene is brought across particularly well is up to the characters themselves. If what the narrator is explaining is poorly established by the characters in the scene, can you really rely on the narrator fully? I guess that's up to personal discretion. The narrator even specified the same thing earlier, but said it in such vague terms that it really didn't sell the how or why.
With that act, Kratos knew he could no longer serve his master.
That was the first establishment that Ares was at fault, but there were no details whatsoever. Without the narration, there's no real way to know that Ares was at fault, so it's not really something you can rely on by itself. That said, despite Kratos himself never specifying the true extent of what Ares had to do with the death of Calliope and Lysandra, it gives you enough to know that he was responsible and also leaves it up to the player to fill in the blanks themselves, showing that the developers had a level of faith in their own audience that despite leaving it up to your own interpretation, that most people would come to the same conclusion. Unless you're me, apparently. But even then, there is still an elephant in the room in regards to this plot point. Once you get past the specific events, it's also worth discussing why Ares would do any of this at all. Ares wanted Calliope and Lysandra out of the way because he felt they were holding Kratos back, but the fact that it blew up so spectacularly in his face honestly made me wonder how he could have believed this would have gone anything but poorly. The idea that I'm going to take away the two things that this guy holds more dear than anything in the world, and that's somehow going to make him more loyal to me, and not only that, but I'm going to be completely honest with him as well, is someone acting in a manner that, in theory, is so divorced from reality that it's hard to buy. I wouldn't honestly blame someone for taking issue with that, but then again, we're talking about Ares here. It may potentially be divorced from reality, but Ares himself is so divorced from reality because he's such an otherworldly being, if you see what I mean. So to an extent, you can't judge him based on the logic that we understand as humans. I've heard a few possible explanations as to why Ares might have done this without realizing the potential consequences. The first possible explanation I've heard is that Ares is just plain dumb, which I don't know about that, Chief. Athena may be the goddess of wisdom, strategy, and a bunch of other things, but I can't see how Ares could have possibly gotten this far without at least a basic level of intellect. If anything, I'd characterize him as headstrong above all. He acts brashly and impulsively, but he's not the type of god of war that would stage a Russian invasion in the dead of winter, for example. The explanation that I subscribe to is the idea that Ares did this because he views everything through the lens of war, so he doesn't understand the concept of human compassion. He is correct in the sense that Kratos' wife and child were holding him back, but Ares views it as holding him back from becoming the perfect warrior, when in actuality, his wife and child are the only thing holding him back from becoming completely disenfranchised and turning on Ares. He completely misread the situation, like a rich person trying to understand poor people. oh, you're homeless, why don't you just buy a house? That kind of thing. And all because Ares, being a god, and furthermore being the god of war, doesn't understand human compassion. Because hey, what reason does Kratos have to not be loyal to Ares? Ares saved his life and helped Kratos make Sparta greater than ever. Sure, people and even the gods see Kratos as a monster, but that's a small price to pay for the glory of Sparta. Kratos trusted Ares, so based on how the scene was presented, Ares could have easily feigned ignorance, pulled a Palpatine and blamed Kratos for his own actions, or potentially even blamed another one of the gods and nobody would question it. In fact, if he was taking this as an opportunity to manipulate Kratos while making him stronger instead of merely making him stronger, Athena would have been a really easy person to blame this on, because whose temple was Kratos attacking? It's actually an interesting thought. How differently would this game have played out if Ares thought to blame Athena for the tragedy in Kratos' life? If Ares could have had his cake and eaten it too? If you kept it to a second act twist, you'd probably be making an entirely different game, but then again, you could have had this be a great deception and have the game play out in relatively the same way it did if the true final flashback was where Kratos discovers the deception of Ares. It might have been interesting to have the flashback seemingly be working counterintuitive to the scenes happening in the present. Why are we working with the gods against Ares and all that? Confusing the player until the final revelation of Ares betraying Kratos to try and make him the greatest warrior ever. Anybody who knows anything about Greek mythology would probably be able to guess the twist, but it still would have potentially been an extra wrinkle in the story. But Ares took responsibility because that's what he, in his point of view, thought was the correct way to go. He thought Kratos was just like himself and would take this event as Ares himself would. Why would he think this? Well, simple. We assume of others what we know of ourselves, and the gods have proven themselves to be anything but self-aware. Why else would they constantly act rashly to prevent prophecies from happening only to be the direct cause of them happening? You'd think a bit of pattern recognition and knowledge of their own actions would do the gods some good one of these days. Perhaps if Ares didn't bring about Lysandra and Calliope's death, he would have never been able to mold Kratos into the perfect force of nature capable of taking down Olympus, but then again, Ares would still be alive. Which is the ultimate irony that was displayed in the post-final boss cutscene. Ares did make the perfect warrior, but the perfect warrior to kill him, not to help him.
I was trying to make you a great warrior.
Bitch, please. And the irony factor goes deeper than that. Ares did win in the end, sort of. So yeah, he wanted to make Kratos the perfect warrior by removing his mortal ties, something that Ares succeeded at, but the reasons he did this were twofold. He wanted to bring about the end of Olympus, and he wanted to become the new ruler of Greece. Obviously the latter didn't happen, but the former did. Ares was the one to set off the chain of events that caused Kratos to work with the gods, become the new god of war, be betrayed, and ultimately destroy the fabric of Olympus. Ares got what he wanted, sort of. And it only cost him, well, his life. But that's not a big deal. Kratos has crawled out of Hades so many times, I'm pretty sure he gets a free sundae next time he dies. Although, does that apply if it's a different afterlife? I guess with all that said, the question remains, is this whole ordeal a chink in the armor of the story? Well, that depends. I appreciate that it leaves it up to the player to discover these things. As I said, they have enough confidence in how they've presented the story that they can have the audience come to their own conclusions on who was in the right and who was in the wrong, despite nobody being a saint, and through that still generally come out with the intended impression. But it is, at least in my experiences, something that's easy to overlook the details of, and even then, you have to come to your own conclusion as to how these things make sense in some cases. How Ares' personality informs his decision-making, for example. But hey, at least there is an explanation. Many games don't even get that. I'm sure this entire video came across as me holding up a giant neon sign saying, "I'm dumb but I can explain," but I still think it's an interesting topic to discuss. Honestly, I was a bit hesitant to even release this video, but here we are. This was honestly a bit of a Frankenstein's monster video considering how many rewrites it went through and how many times I had to scrap various bits and re-record it. It's a long story. That's all I got. Feel free to leave a comment telling me what you think, but don't forget, we're all God of War fans here. And if you like this video, feel free to drop a like and give me a subscribe. Maybe then I'll remember that I used to do ending bits like this and then stopped for some reason. I've been the King of Snark Style, representing Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you all next time. Peace.